Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, December 22nd, 2023, and today we're going to be talking about a bombshell report that was released early this morning around President Trump and the Michigan elections, finding that Donald Trump pressured county-level officials to not certify the 2020 presidential election results in the state of Michigan. Now, to give a bit of context, the state of Michigan went to Donald Trump in the last election by a margin of 2.8%. It was a state that was very close and one that was decisive in handing Joe Biden the presidency in the 2020 presidential election. That state, alongside many others, had flipped from the Donald Trump column as it had voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election by less than a percentage point or a margin of around 11,000 votes. And in this discussion with the Michigan election officials, he and the chairwoman of the RNC, Ronna McDaniel, pressured these election officials to not sign on to certify the election results, leading into an ever-evolving case around President Trump on the back end trying to prevent the 2020 election from concluding or being certified. And this decision from President Trump is one that comes alongside many of the decisions he made in the 2020 election following, at least, to overturn different election results. Whether it was the call with Brad Raffensperger to have him not certify the election results and, in his words, quote, find 11,000 more votes, or pressuring Governor Doug Ducey from the state of Arizona to not certify the election results and overturn what happened in that battleground state. All across the country, Donald Trump tried to overturn the election results, whether through governor officials, now local officials, and what we are seeing is that it extends well beyond the initial scope around the state of Georgia, where the current court case is actually compiling. Now, with this new report out of the state of Michigan, we find that Donald Trump went so far as to go so deep into county-level officials was how far willing he was willing to go to overturn the results of the election. And so with this new bombshell report, we find that President Trump has continued to try to overturn the election results, not only in Georgia, not only across the states that he did so publicly, but now we are finding out that he did so privately in many more ways. And I think this leads directly into the criminal court cases that we are seeing pop up and populate for President Trump. The 4 indictments that he currently has been served, the federal investigation into the election on the national level, the Georgia election investigation. That one was circulated heavily around the call that was leaked between him and Brad Raffensperger. The classified documents case of what's going on in Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump taking classified documents from the White House and keeping them in his private resort. And the hush money case with Stormy Daniels and involving many others too. We find that case itself too is piling onto this significant amount of court cases and indictments that President Trump is currently under. And now this report from Michigan only adds to the evidence that we have seen compiled against him in the eyes of the American voter. Now, this report from Michigan is not one that has been leaked from any type of criminal investigation around President Trump. The recordings actually show here that President Trump was talking to these canvassers, but that's the extent of where this recording have really gone, just to the press, not to, at least to our knowledge, any type of federal investigation. So for right now, it seems as if this will not be considered as a factor in part. I guess it really will be in terms of how voters see it, but it will not be considered a factor in part of the criminal proceedings that Donald Trump is presently under for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election. And so this is something that just adds on to the already insurmounting evidence that is being faced up against President Donald Trump, adding into this idea that Donald Trump did, in fact, try to use his political position and power to overturn the election. And while many Democrats would have agreed from that from the very beginning, it's very different when you look at the average American voter who maybe hasn't exactly made up their mind around the 2020 election, maybe believes that it was fair and held accordingly as it should have been, and Joe Biden fairly won the election, but they don't necessarily agree that Donald Trump broke any laws besides disagreeing with the election results and thus calling it rigged. And so these new reports add into this idea that Donald Trump participated in criminal activity and actively sought to overturn the election through pressure, through, every means necessary, even going so far now as to going to very localized officials. I mean, this in particular really shocked me, that he was even willing to make a call such as this, willing even to get involved with the RNC, with Ronna McDaniel. But in retrospect, actually, it makes a lot of sense, because he was willing to do any and everything to overturn the election results. And so now we are seeing that people like Ronna McDaniel are being called a witness in the Georgia indictment. They were already, but this only adds to the reason why they would be called in, and maybe could even expand into a line of questioning that could serve to Donald Trump's detriment. Now that we know some of these people, especially the GOP chairwoman, was involved in trying to pressure election officials to not certify election results, is where you really start to see that the collusion wasn't just on the high level in the White House, but across high-level party lines. Across the GOP, whether it's the officials in the Senate, in the House, at the RNC, at the NRSC, at the NRCC, it is starting to paint a picture that Donald Trump, with his efforts to overturn the election, which we sort of knew wasn't entirely unbacked, but actually had the direct help and benefit of people like the GOP chairwoman. We knew Donald Trump had his side of the wing of the party, members of the White House, members of his legal team alongside him during the 2020 election. But on the flip side now, this expands it well beyond, and will actually start to potentially cause some level of legal issues beyond what we already know, especially for those who we already see, his allies, who are now facing legal blowback. People who signed on to be alternative in their eyes, but in fact, fake slates of electors to go to the state capitol to cast their ballots for Donald Trump are now facing the possibility of jail time, hefty fines, a legal battle that will potentially disqualify them from holding public office in the future, potentially disqualify them from practically anything related to running in government, to being involved in the government. And it's something that many Republicans saw, at least at the time, as backing President Trump, but in reality was causing them a whole wide range of legal peril and legal trouble that they are now confronting right now. And so with this Michigan call, it adds in the eyes of the American public to his level of criminal record. People are not pleased with the way that Donald Trump is handling these federal investigations. The one saving grace for the Democratic Party is that Donald Trump has been adamant in all of these federal investigations and statewide investigations and cases that matter for him is that he's innocent. And while you would never want to admit to guilt, to the American public, many people do not think that he is innocent. He's trying to paint this picture that this is a witch hunt, and it isn't working in the way that it should be, right? And we see this happening with opinion polling data that questions right now in the general election, who would you vote for? Okay, in some instances, Biden is winning by 2. In some cases, it's tied. In some cases, Trump is winning. But then they follow it up with a question: if Donald Trump is convicted in the court cases that we've heard about him now, if he's convicted in what we have seen happening across the United States, whether it's Georgia, whether it's the cases, whether it's the hush money, whether it's the federal investigation around the election, regardless of what it is, people don't like voting for anyone that they think is a convicted criminal, and that's the language the Democrats will use to describe President Trump. You start to see a significant swing. For instance, Biden would be up by 2, but instead, he would be up by 6 if Donald Trump was convicted. In some cases, too, according to Yahoo and YouGov, in a very recent poll done actually just 2 days ago, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are tied nationally. But again, if there was the case of Donald Trump being convicted of a serious crime in the coming months, Joe Biden wins by 7. So a 7-point swing in favor of President Biden, that's quite substantial. That is a huge swing, because if Biden is down a point going into the election, and then all of a sudden these legal proceedings conclude, or we find a decision from a jury, from a judge, that Donald Trump is in fact convicted of what people see as a serious crime, and a lot of people do see election interference as a serious crime, as hush money as a serious crime, as involvement in any type of criminal activity, especially for somebody who has served as president of the United States, that is something that they would deem to be a serious crime. You start to see where these people flip and where they switch. And even amongst the GOP, a party that has adored President Trump over the past 8 years, has very much been infatuated by him and willing to back him election after election and now another election, they find that even in the GOP primary, if Donald Trump is convicted of a serious crime, his primary support drops 15% down to 41%. DeSantis jumps up to 21, Haley jumps up to 16, and for the first time in GOP primary polling data since I think maybe March of 2022, the combined vote share against President Trump would be enough to defeat him in a one-on-one race, which means there could be, in this reality, some consolidation of a Republican that is not Donald Trump, such as Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, that could captivate the base that is upset with a criminal being at the top of their ticket. And so that's where you start to see this support really crack. People are not willing to vote for somebody who is a convicted felon, who is currently serving time in prison. In some reality, I don't think it'll be this one, but in some reality out there, there is a situation in which Donald Trump ends up the Republican nominee, gets sentenced to jail because of Georgia or the federal case, ends up serving time in prison while running for president, and then voters reject them on that alone. You can see here too, Reuters and Ipsos did a poll way back when, but it was still very, very much relevant today. You find that that voters simply would not vote for Donald Trump if he was convicted of a federal crime by a jury. 57% of Americans say no, they would not vote for him. That's roughly on par with what we've seen in other polls as well. And currently serving time in prison, 60% say no. And in that reality, you could actually see a pretty substantive Joe Biden victory. That's because voters simply do not want to vote for candidates that they seem to be as, convicted felons, as criminals, whatever it might be. It is the reason why Democrats are banking so heavily on this, because they know that in a reality in which Donald Trump goes to jail, or a reality in which Donald Trump even is convicted by a grand jury, you are going to see substantial shifts nationally in terms of support, just as we see it now with the current data. And so knowing that, Democrats assume that there is a reality in which maybe the numbers don't look so hot right now, but by the time we reach the election, Donald Trump has gone through so much legal battles and legal trouble that Democrats come out ahead on election day. And it's not exactly a bet that is entirely flawed. Now, the Supreme Court today made a decision that actually benefits Donald Trump. We found that, I don't have the article up here, actually I'm sure I could just pick it off from the New York Times website, but the Supreme Court decided that they were not going to fast track Donald Trump's immunity case. And so what that means is that the court case for Donald Trump will in fact be back to an appeals court, which of course will end up making it up to the United States Supreme Court. They wanted to fast track it there because everybody knew it was going to reach the Supreme Court case, but the Supreme Court decided that largely in the interest of President Trump, so it seems at least, they are going to postpone this to push the court case to potentially even be further, to a point where it's during the election or potentially even after. And so Democrats are upset about this because they see this as a negative, because it shows that the Supreme Court isn't willing to hear this case on Trump's immunity defense. They aren't willing to take up a case that they know is going to inevitably get to the United States Supreme Court. And so that's a problem for Democrats. And it means that maybe banking on this idea that he will be a convicted criminal by election day will not be reality. But on the flip side of things, it's not entirely over yet, and Democrats certainly aren't giving up on that strategy either, and I'm sure they have a strategy to win without it. I do believe that the Supreme Court is acting in the interest of President Trump, which is to be expected, but you can only act so far. Donald Trump may be benefiting in GOP primary polls right now because he hasn't been convicted, but the moment that he is, you actually see a reversion in support. You also see that reversion in support happening on the national level as well. This is not the results you want to see by the time you reach election day if you are Donald Trump. If you are seeing a 7-point swing because of what a jury or a judge might say of you, you should be worried, because it means that voters here are very much calculating their vote for you or against you based on what's happening with your criminal proceedings. And I think looking at how many court cases that Donald Trump is presently under, there is a reality in which Donald Trump does in fact get a guilty verdict. And that would be truly detrimental to his campaign and to his chances for 2024. And it also doesn't help that in a court case like Georgia, where Donald Trump simply cannot pardon himself, even in a reality in which Donald Trump is, somehow reelected, which is possible, especially right now. I think it's likelier more than not, today at least, you will find that statewide decision, Donald Trump cannot pardon himself from. So there could be a circumstance, I'm not saying it's likely, but there could be some random one-off circumstance where Donald Trump is not elected and convicted and goes to jail, or he is elected, is convicted, and does go to jail and can't pardon himself. And so that would be a very, very interesting case. I don't know how the world, the nation would react to that, but it's not entirely out of the question. Because for all we know right now, all of these legal cases could be very damning for President Trump. And they already have been, and the polls suggest that they absolutely will be if they reach a verdict by election day that is not favorable to Donald Trump. What we know too is that Fani Willis, who is the Fulton County District Attorney, says that Donald Trump will not get a special break. She is adamant that Donald Trump will get the same treatment as any other person in this case, which for his case is not a good thing, because the evidence that has been compiled against him, the evidence that is now surmounting to build public perception, a public narrative, and more evidence against him in future proceedings that might arise as Michigan still investigates the 2020 election, there are some serious problems here for President Trump. And all of it has to do with his legal battles, and we will see what happens. But if he is convicted by Election Day, his chances of re-election are much slimmer than they are right now. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.